Council of Alberta is strongly opposing the government's plan for an emissions cap. The plan will put a cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector set at 35 to 38% below 2019 levels by 2030. While the Business Council say this would harm economic growth and ultimately delay investment in decarbonization. Adam Legge is president of the Business Council of Alberta. He's in Ottawa for meetings with the federal government. Adam Legge, it's good to meet you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, David.
So you've said you want to work collaboratively with the federal government, but you also say you cannot support this policy in every form, any form.
Yes.
How do we bridge those two positions?
Well, thanks for having me on, David. Great question. All our members and our organization fully agree with emissions reduction. We're on board, believe in and subscribe to Canada's net zero by 2050 targets. We want to work with government because we think this is a flawed approach to doing so for two main reasons. The first off, good public policy that delivers, checks off a number of boxes, and this policy, the cap as proposed, does not check those boxes. But more importantly, a series of unintended consequences that an emissions cap will ultimately become a prosperity cap, because we're going to see an additional and layering on of investment uncertainty, another policy, another thing that has to be dealt with on top of existing uncertainty in the investment environment. And we'll see the investment in emissions reduction not happen. We'll see that investment go elsewhere. We'll see the production go to other countries that don't care about emissions reduction. So we're trying to say to the government, if we're trying to solve for this equation, we have an existing structure, the carbon pricing system in Canada. Let's work with that. And let's not try and layer on more stuff that's ultimately going to lead to no investment and no emissions reduction.
Right. So the plan is, as I remember it, it does contemplate an increase in production over the next several years just to meet a surge in demand. But then it wants to stop sort of unabated carbon production, things like natural gas. And the Premier of Alberta has vowed to fight this in significant ways. So what is a way to get industry to reduce its emissions to the level that Canada and the world say they need without some sort of an enforcement mechanism like a cap to force them to invest in the technology and the cleaning up of the sector?
Two things. One, first and foremost, let's get all of the things that we're talking about across the finish line. Let's get the investor tax credits for carbon capture across the finish line, contracts for difference across the finish line. Let's tackle the clean electricity regulations, which have significant implications for the oil and gas sector, to reduce the investment uncertainty, create the investment structure we need and the environment we need to bring in the billions of dollars. And then two, let's rely on the existing structure we've got. We have a pricing mechanism in Canada for industrial emitters that is meant to work down the emissions over time. And so we need to rely on the existing structures that we've got, solidify the investment environment, and let industry innovate and do what it does. And I think we'll see emissions come down.
But this has been the conversation in this country now for decades. I mean, even Stephen Harper ran on a carbon tax, you know, in the 2011 election. And yet in the oil and gas sector, it's the one sector where emissions are still going up. So how does the country, you know, keep having the conversation of the right way to do it when for more than a decade, there's been a recognition this needs to go down and it hasn't happened at the pace and scale that the country needs to hit its climate targets?
Yeah. Well, we are reducing emissions intensity. Emissions intensity is down 30% over the past decade. So we are making the production of oil and gas more efficient than we have in previous history. But we are in an investment vacuum right now. This country has not got the right mechanisms in place. If we can get the emissions innovations happening and the technology enabled for carbon capture and other kinds of abatement technologies to be invested, which, as I talked about earlier, is that carbon capture, the contracts for difference, clean electricity regulations. We need to lock down that investment environment, which is what industry is waiting for. We're still waiting for that environment to be locked down. We're looking south of the border at the very attractive conditions under the IRA in the US. Let's make Canada competitive, work with the existing carbon price that we have for industrial emitters, lock down that investment environment, and we will see that investment happening, which will then lower emissions. We just haven't set the table yet fully for those investment decisions to happen. So we're talking about a lot of potential situations of emissions reduction, but we've got to get the investment environment, let the investment happen, and then we'll see emissions come down.
But do the financial markets want to invest if they don't have a clear target and a clear plan and a clear pathway to, say, 2030, to 2035, to 2050? I mean, the regulations at the federal level are designed in some ways to try to give benchmarks and targets so that global capital knows what it's putting its money into. Yep. If you pull that back, we've already seen groups like BlackRock say they're not going to, necessarily finance some of these things going forward. I mean, what are the consequences of not having a clear path to 2050 that's agreed on at all levels of government?
I would say there are a series of paths. We have the commitment to net zero by 2050. We've got industry that needs to have certainty on when those investments you can flick the switch, they're going to start to capture carbon, they're going to start to abate emissions, and then you can build a credible timeline from there. We're speculating in terms of when these things will be happening, when the switch will be flicked in terms of carbon capture and other sort of technologies. We can't build a pathway in an environment of policy uncertainty, in terms of an environment of investment uncertainty. We can talk about targets all we want, but we're 5.75 years away from 2030 without any certainty on those three items we talked about, without a single shovel in the ground. We need to be able to get certainty so then we can build a consistent and credible path to net zero by 2050 along a certain series of gates. But we just don't have that.
And we may be 18 months away from an election where all of this could change, right? So you've been meeting with federal ministers, federal departments while you were here. Who exactly have you spoken with, and what has their response to your argument been?
We've been meeting with officials in finance, environment, NRCan, PCO. The response has been, look, we want to find a way to reduce emissions. We want to find a way to ensure that we're continuing the prosperity. We're continuing to support the resource sector in a way that isn't a production cut. But this is the framework we've committed to. So we're trying to talk about how do we make sure that we solve for what is the ultimate end goal, emissions reduction. If that's the case, this is not the way to go about it. Let's be open to a variety of different conversations and approaches, bring the best minds to work on this problem, and then come up with the ultimate strategy. But we're keen to work with them on how to do that.
Adam Legge, President of the Business Council of Alberta. Good to meet you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks.